And joining me now is Democratic Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal of Washington. Congresswoman Jayapal, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Thank you so much, Kristen. It's great to be with you.
It's great to have you back. I do want to start on Cuba. You actually just came back from a 5-day congressional delegation in Cuba where you did meet with President Diaz-Canel. You heard him say in the interview that he effectively would not commit to the broad asks of the United States, including releasing political prisoners, committing to holding multi-party elections. Do you think Cuba needs to take those steps in order to move toward normalization with the United States?
Kristen, I think what is really important and what he said to us and what I heard him saying this morning as well on the interview is that there need to be real negotiations. And that has been a frustration for Cuba, that there hasn't been a real negotiation with agenda items on the table for the United States and for Cuba. And I think there is a real appropriate desire for America to respect Cuba's sovereignty. The embargo is the longest running embargo against any country in world history. The fuel blockade is just the latest part of that. But the humanitarian crisis on the ground and the collective punishment and cruelty towards the Cuban people, civilians, by the United States foreign policy is really outrageous. And I feel from my visit to Cuba that Americans would not want that to continue if they understood what was actually happening on the ground. And so that's why we were there for 5 days, to hear from all sides. We met with political dissidents. We met with the president, as you mentioned. We met with civil society organizations, religious leaders, entrepreneurs, people who see the opportunity for a real normalization of relations between the United States and Cuba.
Well, and Congresswoman, I wonder if you met with the political prisoners. There's still more than 1,200 of them. And in my conversation with President Diaz-Canel, he would not commit to releasing any of them. You have obviously talked about this. You just said you met with a number of people. Do you believe Cuba needs to release its 1,200 political prisoners in order for negotiations to move forward effectively?
I do, and this has been something that I've raised directly with the president, both this time and 2 years ago when I was in Cuba. I think that was the last time there were any members of Congress there. I think I've been the last person to visit Cuba twice in the last 2 years. Last time I actually met with the families of political prisoners. We took a list in to the president, and I think that what I have heard from the Cuban government is let's put all these items on the table. He did just announce that they were releasing 2,000 prisoners. Not all of those are political prisoners, but we understand that some of them are. And I think that this is the kind of thing that we should push for in an actual country-to-country negotiation, not a dialogue, but a negotiation with actual items on the agenda. That's how we're going to move forward, is through that kind of diplomacy, not through, an economic bombing of the infrastructure of Cuba that hurts just everyday civilians and inflicts a level of cruelty onto the Cuban people.
Yeah, no, you're right. There's a lot of skepticism about whether any of those 2,000 were political prisoners at all. Very quickly, do you believe President Diaz-Canel is the best person to lead Cuba, or do you agree with the Trump administration that there needs to be an overhaul in Cuban leadership?
I don't think it is for the United States to determine who leads another country. I don't think we would like that here in the United States, and I don't think that it's appropriate for us to dismiss the sovereignty of civilians in other countries to choose their leaders. And so I think the way we get to a true democratic future for Cuba with dignity and freedom is by those negotiations and ultimately by the ability for the Cuban people to thrive and for freedom to reign across Cuba. That's not through blockading a drop of oil from reaching an island, through bombing the economic economic infrastructure of the island and through maximalist foreign policy pressures threatening military intervention. It's through negotiation and diplomacy. That's how we get there.
Congresswoman, let's talk about Iran now. As you know, Vice President J.D. Vance announcing no deal after marathon talks with Iran in Pakistan. Do you support these negotiations as a way to bring an end to this war? Do you think that is the best way to bring an end to it?
I do, Kristen, absolutely support negotiations. Let's remember that it was Donald Trump who took us out of and negotiated nuclear arms deal with Iran that was negotiated by President Obama in 2015. Donald Trump removed us from that in 2018. And that is what has led us to the place that we're in. Those negotiations took over 2 years. I don't think that in this situation that we were necessarily going to get to an agreement again with a day of negotiations. I feel good that perhaps there's still a path for these negotiations, but we should be clear. Donald Trump got us into this mess. He went into a war with Iran that was unauthorized and illegal. And because of that, we are in the mess that we're in now. There was no strategy, no plan, no authorization. We are now spending about $1 to $2 billion a day on this war with Iran. And it is a huge cost for the American people with rising energy prices, but also a lack of focus on the domestic issues that really drive people's lives. He's saying we don't have money for childcare, we don't have money for housing because we're at war with Iran. That was a war of choice. That is a war of choice. And we should never have been in this position to start with. This is an absolute outrage that this is what the Trump administration has gotten us into. And I don't think it's good for the people of the United States or for the civilians in Iran, in Lebanon, across the Middle East.
I do want to ask you about your colleague, Congressman Eric Swalwell. You heard me discussing this with Congressman Donalds. He's facing allegations of sexual assault from a former staff member, which we should say Swalwell says are completely false and politically motivated. Notable, though, House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries, Senator Adam Schiff, Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi are calling for Swalwell to end his run for California governor. Do you think that Swalwell should drop out of the gubernatorial race?
I absolutely do. This is, as you know, I've been very vocal on behalf of survivors of the Epstein scandal. And I think that what we are seeing now is an emergence of women across the country who have been dismissed, told to shut up, told to move on, who have been abused by men in powerful positions. This is not a partisan issue. This cuts across party line, and it is a depravity of the way that women have been treated. And I'm just inspired by the courage and the bravery of the women who came forward. This is clearly a pattern. I've already called for Congressman Swalwell to drop out of the gubernatorial race, and I think we have to hold everybody accountable.
Do you think, you just heard Congressman Donald say he would vote to expel Eric Swalwell. Will you vote to expel Eric Swalwell?
And Congressman Gonzalez, I would. I've already said that I think that these things, charges and allegations and the pattern of abuse, and in Congressman Gonzalez's case, he actually admitted to the affair with the, or to, harassment with his staffer. This is also important for staffers across the Capitol to see that their bosses don't get to do this to them. So I do think that both of them need to step down from Congress, let these investigations happen. But I think that this is very important, that we believe women and that we show people across the Capitol and across the country that we will not accept this kind of behavior.
Very quickly, before I let you go, former Vice President Kamala Harris joined several other Democratic leaders at the Al Sharpton convention this week. She was asked a question about whether she was going to run again in 2028. She said, quote, "I'm thinking about it." Do you think former Vice President Kamala Harris should run for president again in 2028? Is she the strongest person to represent Democrats?
I think we should have a big contested primary, and everyone that thinks that they have an opportunity to really represent and show leadership for this country as president should run and should make their case, and the people should look very carefully at every single candidate. But it should be a happy, big, exciting attempt for us to be able to really see who has what it takes to lead our party forward. That's what we need, bold leadership, and I'm looking forward to a primary that demonstrates that from lots of candidates.
All right, well, it's only 2026, but in some ways it's right around the corner. Congresswoman Jayapal, thank you so much for being here this Sunday. We really appreciate it.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.